There is a verse in the Bible that, although it stands in plain sight, remains hidden from most. It's not buried in obscure books or complex passages. On the contrary, it's openly displayed in a letter written by Paul to the Romans, yet it holds a power that few truly access. Most people read this verse as a poetic metaphor, failing to realize that it is, in fact, a spiritual key, a code of alignment with the Creator and one's life purpose. It is an eternal principle, a divine password for manifestation, a bridge between the invisible and the visible, between the spiritual world and the material world. This verse does more than just reveal a spiritual truth. It activates, transforms, breaks patterns, and reprograms entire atmospheres. I'm referring to Romans 4:17, where it is written that God calls those things which do not exist as though they did. A simple statement, yet it carries the very DNA of creation. When we immerse ourselves in this verse, we enter a realm of power where faith stops being a passive belief and becomes an active vibrational force. In this realm, reality responds not to what we see, but to what we dare to declare as already real. But before we explore what it truly means to call those things that are not as though they were, we must confront a silent issue that affects millions. Faith, disconnected from action. We live in a time when many pray, but few believe they have already received. They speak with words, but doubt with emotions. They attend church, but harbor fear, scarcity, and uncertainty in their hearts. It's as if much of modern spirituality is built on begging rather than proclaiming, on pleading rather than exercising authority. And here arises an uncomfortable question. Are we relating to God as heirs or as desperate beggars? The answer to that question can completely alter your spiritual trajectory. Because Romans 4:17 is not only about what God does, it reveals a divine pattern of action that must be imitated by His children. If God calls things that do not exist as though they did, then we, made in His image and likeness, were also designed to do the same. This is the secret behind the most powerful spiritual, physical, emotional, and financial manifestations we hear about. Reality responds to the language of faith, and faith has its own vocabulary, a frequency of certainty that precedes evidence. Faith is not waiting to see, it is declaring as real, even when everything seems to say otherwise. Napoleon Hill, in his masterpiece Think and Grow Rich, reveals that every major human achievement began with a burning desire and unwavering faith in its realization. But there is something deeper behind this idea. True faith does not only believe, it acts. Faith moves, builds, and plants seeds, even in the midst of storms. Hill speaks about the power of creative visualization and repeated affirmations as tools to reprogram the subconscious and align a person with the frequency of what they want to attract. Although secular, his insight resonates powerfully with the biblical principle found in Romans 4:17. True biblical faith is not distant hope. It is active, vibrant. It calls, declares, and proclaims. And that is exactly what makes this verse so powerful and so neglected at the same time. Many Christians are still waiting for a supernatural intervention from heaven, unaware that heaven has already released the instruction. God has already declared, call, proclaim, visualize with faith, live as though it already were. Because in the spiritual realm where God dwells, time is not linear. What will be already is. And when we align our words with this eternal truth, we begin to see the impossible bow before what we dared to call forth with spiritual boldness. That is why so many remain stuck, not because of a lack of prayer, but a lack of conviction, not because they don't have faith in their hearts, but because of an absence of vibrational coherence between what they feel, what they speak, and how they act. When God calls something that does not yet exist as if it already did, He is teaching us how to operate outside of chronological time. He is training us to live by the Spirit, where reality is shaped by inner vision and not external circumstances. Now imagine this. What if you began to treat your health as if you were already healed? What if you began to act like a loving father even before holding your child in your arms? What if you began to give thanks for a debt already paid before the money ever arrived? Romans 4:17 challenges us to do just that, to live as though the miracle had already occurred, not from illusion, but from alignment with the divine truth that has already decreed victory in the invisible realm. That is the secret of conscious co-creation. That is the language of the kingdom. What once seemed mystical or purely spiritual is now supported by discoveries in neuroscience and epigenetics. Bruce Lipton, a renowned cellular biologist, stated that our cells respond more to emotional vibration than to internal chemistry. In other words, the human body doesn't need to see to react. It only needs to feel deeply. When you vividly imagine a situation with genuine emotion, your brain and body begin to behave as if it were already happening. This is the secret behind the power of creative visualization. The brain doesn't distinguish between what is intensely imagined and what is real. It simply responds. When we connect this principle with the spiritual truth of Romans 4:17, we realize that the divine call to call things that are not as though they were is not merely a metaphysical suggestion. It's a blueprint of total alignment between spirit, mind, and body. This is a spiritual code of manifestation that activates physiological responses and opens invisible doors. Every thought becomes a seed, every emotion is the water, and every declaration of faith is the light that causes that seed to grow into reality. And here lies a practical key that can radically shift the way you live your spirituality: gratitude in advance. When you give thanks for something before it arrives, you are vibrating at the frequency of certainty, not doubt. You are behaving like a child who trusts the Father, not like a spiritual orphan begging for scraps. Gratitude in advance is faith in motion. It's prophetic action. It's when you write "paid in the name of Jesus" on a bill, even when your bank account is empty. It's when you pray for healing and already see yourself walking in freedom before the medical tests even come back. This attitude is not madness, it's alignment. And when this posture becomes a habit, the atmosphere around you begins to shift. The spiritual environment responds. The natural world starts to bow before the power radiating from your inner being. That's exactly what happened to Eliane. She was in a deeply difficult phase, burdened with overdue bills, mounting debts, and a sense of helplessness that paralyzed her. Days felt endless, and nights were haunted by anxious thoughts about how she would make it through tomorrow. But during what seemed like an ordinary church service, the words of Romans 4:17 struck her like a whisper from God himself. It wasn't just a reading, it was an activation. Eliane felt each word penetrate her soul like an ancient code being reawakened. God calls those things which do not exist as though they did, echoed within her like a spiritual trumpet. When she returned home, she did something she had never done before. She printed out every single overdue bill, laid them out on the table, grabbed a red pen, and wrote across each one, "Paid in the name of Jesus." It wasn't symbolic, it was warfare. From that day forward, she created a sacred ritual. Every morning she looked at her bills with the eyes of someone who had already overcome. She declared, "I am prosperous. I live in abundance. All my needs are supplied by the God who cares for me." She began to imagine herself walking in peace, free from the weight of lack. She began to thank God daily for the money she had not yet seen, but already envisioned as a flowing stream released from heaven. This attitude didn't just change her frequency, it changed her destiny. Just over 2 months after she started this faith-filled creative visualization routine, Eliane received an unexpected offer for a remote job. The financial proposal surpassed anything she had earned in years. But the real miracle wasn't in the salary, it was in the inner transformation. The fear that once dominated her was replaced by calm confidence. Anxiety gave way to deep gratitude. Eliane became wealthy long before the money arrived. She had learned to call her new reality before it physically appeared. Her vibration changed before her bank statement did. The spiritual transformation preceded the material. This is the secret so many overlook. Miracles are responses to postures, not just to prayers. When you behave like someone who has already received, the universe responds. Faith that acts as if it already is attracts as if it already has. And that is exactly what Romans 4:17 taught Eliane. Not just a verse, but an entirely new way of living. This story may seem extraordinary, but it reveals a principle accessible to anyone willing to walk by faith. The difference between those who live in miracles and those who merely pray for them is the willingness to act as if they already are. This is what separates the spiritual spectator from the spiritual protagonist. Eliane chose not to be just a hearer of the word, but a bold practitioner of it. And that is the invitation for you today. Dare to live as someone who has already received. Because in the eyes of the Creator, the promise is already established. The only thing left is for you to align yourself with it. Anderson was a self-employed salesman, a tireless worker. The kind who woke up early, faced the sun and rain, crossed the city with hope in his heart and overdue bills in his pocket. But something held him back. It wasn't just the market, the competition, or the economy. It was an invisible barrier, an emotional and spiritual ceiling that seemed impossible to break through. He could never surpass a certain income threshold. Even in good months, something always happened. An unexpected expense, a non-paying client, a car breakdown. It was as if there were a hidden magnet constantly pulling him back into scarcity. This recurring limitation eventually created a silent resignation. He began to believe that this was his permanent reality, that he was born to survive, not to thrive. And that belief, as subtle as it was destructive, shaped his everyday life. One day, exhausted and emotionally drained, Anderson stepped into an empty church. It wasn't Sunday. There was no service, just silence. And it was in that silence that revelation came. On the altar lay an open Bible. Without even touching it, his eyes were drawn to the words that would echo forever within him. God calls those things which do not exist as though they did. Romans 4:17, once again. But this time, it hit him like a spiritual lightning bolt, splitting the sky of his mind. He read it, reread it, and something ignited. It wasn't just understanding, it was recognition. For the first time, he didn't just see a truth about God. He saw a mirror. If God acts this way, then why, as his child, was he still acting like a defeated servant? That moment became a turning point. Anderson realized he had to break free from the identity he had been carrying. It wasn't enough to want prosperity. He had to proclaim it, declare it, and live as though prosperity already lived within him. And that's exactly what he decided to do. The next morning, he woke up earlier than usual. He looked in the mirror and said aloud, "I am prosperous. I am abundant. I am successful." Not like someone chanting hollow mantras, but like someone activating a higher reality. He began writing his goals with the pen of faith and the ink of certainty. He visualized his bills paid, his table full, his clients smiling and referring him to others. But above all, he envisioned a free mind, a light soul, and a peaceful home. Over time, this posture gained strength, consistency, and authority. Every day, as he left for work, he would proclaim, "Thank you, God, that I am already in my best season." And even when sales didn't happen, he didn't back down. He kept calling. He kept vibrating. He kept living as someone who already was. Because now he knew true faith doesn't retreat in the face of invisible evidence. It acts as if the evidence already exists. 2 months later, a phone call changed his path. A former client, impressed by Anderson's persistence and professionalism, recommended him for a position with a national distribution company. The salary doubled anything he had earned before. Commissions, bonuses, structure, everything he had hoped for. But the real miracle wasn't just the offer, it was the way he received it. Anderson was already ready, because he had already become what he had been calling forth. When the door opened, he wasn't surprised. He gave thanks, because in the spiritual realm, he had been walking through that door for weeks. His inner being was already dwelling in that new reality. His vibration had already paved the way. The job was merely a confirmation of what he had been boldly declaring every day: I am prosperous. Here lies a principle that must be branded into the heart. You don't attract what you want, you attract what you already are. The spiritual realm does not respond to abstract wishes. It responds to the frequency of your identity. Anderson didn't just wish to change, he became the change. He started carrying within him the vibration of what once seemed out of reach. And that is the essence of Romans 4:17. It's not just a formula of words, it is an activated spiritual identity. When you call things that are not as though they were, you are activating your divine identity, acknowledging that what God has promised already exists, and that you are in the process of aligning with that promise. But to do that, you must break with your old identity, the one that says, I am limited, I am small, I am unlucky, I am a victim. As long as you keep repeating those phrases, consciously or unconsciously, you are prophesying lack. Life is shaped by declarations, whether intentional or not. And here lies the great challenge. Who are you calling yourself every day? Who do you say you are when you wake up, when you look in the mirror, when you face a problem? Your words are decrees. Your emotions are silent prayers. Your posture is a living prophecy. Anderson learned this through experience. And that's why his story became living proof that it's not the world that needs to change. It's the vibration of our being. By living as someone who already was, he became a magnet for the reality he desired. He didn't beg for the miracle, he aligned with it. And that's what Romans 4:17 so clearly reveals. God does not wait for things to exist before naming them. He names them, and then they exist. He declares, and then it manifests. When a human being made in God's image imitates that pattern, they access the highest level of practical faith and active spirituality. And at that level, the supernatural becomes a daily experience. Carlos was already in his 60s, a seasoned man shaped by time, losses, and the kinds of lessons only years can teach. He had faced highs and lows, failed projects, unfulfilled dreams, and decisions that, in hindsight, he might have made differently. And yet, there was a spark in his eyes that refused to fade, the desire to start again. However, over time, with repeated disappointments, he had grown used to the idea that perhaps his time had passed. This silent belief kept him trapped in a lukewarm routine, surviving, but no longer expecting. Until one morning, while organizing some old books, he found a notebook filled with dreams he had written down in his youth. There were bold goals, vivid visions, and declarations of faith. As he flipped through those yellowed pages, one handwritten note stood out in bold letters. Romans 4:17. God calls those things which do not exist as though they did. That phrase stopped him in his tracks. Not just because of the memory, but because of the resonance. It was as if that truth, written decades earlier, had finally found a heart mature enough to activate it. He closed his eyes and let those words echo inside him. Calling things that are not as though they were. Could he, at 63, still dare to live with the boldness of one who believes again? The answer didn't come in a voice, but in a decision. Carlos chose to break free from the limiting narrative of age, missed opportunities, and irreversible time. He started on the outside, dressed like the man he envisioned becoming. He pulled out his best suit, groomed himself carefully, wore cologne, not out of vanity, but in alignment with the identity he was activating. Then he made new plans. He picked up his phone and reached out to old contacts, but now with a new posture. Yet the most powerful thing he did happened in silence. Every day, looking in the mirror, he declared, "It's already late," not as a complaint, but as a revelation. In the Creator's time, it is never too late. He declared, "I'm already honored," while visualizing doors opening, partnerships forming, unexpected invitations coming. He proclaimed, "I am light in this new season." And it wasn't just a metaphor, it was a decision to illuminate his thoughts, his emotions, and his words with the certainty that God's time is now. 2 months after immersing himself in this daily prophetic ritual, Carlos received an unusual invitation. An old acquaintance, impressed by his renewed wisdom and demeanor, invited him to join a digital mentorship project focused on personal growth. The detail? The project was aimed at people over 50 who wanted to start again. It was as if heaven whispered, "Yes, it is still time, and the time is now." Carlos didn't just accept, he flourished. He became a mentor to dozens of men and women who had also believed they were too old to begin again. Today, he enjoys financial freedom like never before, and even more, a spiritual richness he describes as the youth of faith. The greatest miracle wasn't the invitation, the salary, or the success. It was the reconfiguration of his identity. He stopped being the man waiting for life to change and became the man who calls what is not as though it already is. Carlos understood that when we align with God's eternal timeline, we enter a dimension where the past no longer defines us and the future is already unfolding in the present. And that's exactly where we all must arrive. Romans 4:17 is not just a verse for young dreamers or those just starting out. It's for everyone. It's for the ones who have failed, fallen, grown weary, or silently given up, but still carry a spark of faith in their chest. It's for those who long to rewrite their story, not based on illusion, but based on an eternal truth. If God calls what is not as though it already is, then so must we. That is the essence of mature faith, a faith that isn't intimidated by diagnoses or delayed by dates on a calendar, a faith that calls, a faith that proclaims, a faith that lives in the frequency of certainty, even when everything shouts, "Too late." Faith is not emotional anesthesia. It is spiritual action. It is when you act like someone who already has, who already is, who already overcame, because in heaven, everything has already been established. The moment you choose to live by faith becomes your turning point. It is the vibrational bridge between who you long to be and who you already are in the divine realm. When you proclaim, "I am the one who calls," you're not just making a statement of belief, you are activating a creative principle, honoring your spiritual inheritance, and aligning with the thought pattern of the kingdom. Every thought becomes a seed, every word becomes a decree, every emotion becomes the fuel for manifestation. And as you do this, you don't just change your reality, you change your identity. You begin to live as a child, not a servant, as a prophet, not a victim, as the co-author of your destiny, not a passive spectator in other people's stories. This is the abundant life Jesus promised, a life of alignment, purpose, power, and truth, a life where your words build the path, your faith becomes matter, and your days carry the lightness of spiritual certainty. So if these words stirred your heart, don't ignore them. They came to you with purpose. Share this message with someone who also needs to remember who they are. Step into your true spiritual identity today. Don't wait for another sign. The sign has already been given. The verse has already been revealed. The invitation has already been made, and now the choice is yours. Keep waiting or start calling. Call with faith, call with boldness, call with conviction, because heaven has already called. And now it's your turn.